What do we usually mean by explanations? I think when we're speaking about explanations, we usually tying the concept of explanation to the concept of prediction. And the interesting part here is that predictions are possible without any understanding of the underlying mechanisms of what is going on. So imagine you were living hundreds, if not thousand years ago, and you were looking at the stars. You had no understanding of what stars are, of what planets are, and yet people, by just observing the night sky, were capable of coming up with theories that had relatively good predictive power. The fascinating part about this is that this is possible, that it's possible for you to grasp one snippet of reality, even on false assumptions. Because most of the assumptions that people were making back in the day about what these stars actually are were wrong. I don't think they consciously conceived of stars as stars. And yet they were able to, within that limited scope of observation, come up with meaningful predictions about what stars will be in what position 1 year from now, let's say. And I think this is generally how we do predictions. They are not necessarily tied to us truly understanding a phenomenon in the sense of going all the way down, of understanding what it's composed of, understanding every single part of the phenomenon, why every single part does what it does, going all the way up from the micro phenomena to the macro phenomena that we're observing. It seems this is not how we usually explain things. We don't start with the smallest and then go to the biggest scale of existence of the respective phenomenon, but we start at a specific scale, at a specific size. We start with something that's given to your consciousness, something that's given to your life world. And from there we move to learning and figuring out ways of being able to predict the behavior of that which we're observing. And that which we're observing might be really a black box to us. We might have no idea what is behind the phenomenon that we're observing. And that's very fascinating because it implies that prediction, which for us is usually tied to explanation, if you can predict something with precision, we usually take this to be something that has been explained, at least in our everyday language. So if someone has a predictive model of something and tell you how things will stand, we usually assume they understand the phenomenon at hand. And you can look at it the other way around. We look at the predictive power and whether predictions come true to figure out whether somebody has understood something. So if someone is not predicting certain phenomena in the economic sphere, we usually then draw from this the conclusion that they didn't understand economics, no matter how smart their theories and no matter how intelligent their theories might sound. And this seems to be true across the board in all different disciplines that are applying causal reasoning. But again, the really funny observation here is that you might have almost, and if not even perfect prediction in given situations, and yet not understand anything about the phenomenon at hand. And this makes the whole thing really difficult to comprehend. Like, what then do we actually mean by an explanation? If prediction alone is not enough to really go at the heart of a phenomenon, then what is? And I'm not sure, because think about Pavlov's dog, for example. The famous example where the dog associates the ringing of the bell with the production of saliva. you might be perfectly able to predict the dog's behavior, and yet from this alone you would never conclude, or you would never be able to know from this prediction alone of what the dog will do given the bells ringing, you will never be able to conclude that the dog has consciousness. And the dog most likely has. I mean, pretty much we all would assume from our own introspection and our own observation, and from being in presence with animals and dogs, we would assume that they are responsive. That we can touch on the level of consciousness and mutual sentience, that just as I experience the dog, I have a sentience for the dog has a sentience for us, right? The dog has some form of representation for us surrounding him, and not representation in the sense of a propositional representation, but the dog most likely has a sense for me. There is someone there in the dog having some kind of sense for who I am. And even if that's not an abstraction, an abstract identity for the dog still will relate to me as someone existing in their sphere of experience. And none of that you would know from predictive powers alone. So you might be perfectly able to predict the dog's behavior without ever referring to the term of consciousness or interiority, without ever invoking it, right? So you might be treating the dog as something it is not, which is something unconscious, and yet be able to predict its behavior. This is very similar to the initially given example with the movements of the stars. You might be able to predict the movements of the stars by mistaking them for something they're not, by treating them as something entirely different from what they actually are. And this, again, makes things very confusing. Because what then is explanation? What do we then mean by explanations? In our everyday use, I guess, with explanation, we mean to go at the bottom, at the heart of things, to see through how they present themselves to the world, the different possible ways in which they could present themselves to the world. So when you have understood something, you don't know it from only one perspective. You don't know it only from the perspective of how it would appear in a certain context. But once you've understood it, you could actually predict how it would show itself in a different context, how it would appear. This is once you have really understood something. I think this is our everyday understanding of understanding something. When we mean to understand, we mean you have gotten at the heart of things, which is to get at the essence of whatever is given there, which means in whatever situation that thing which you have understood shows itself, you will be able to predict how it will appear and how it will be perceived by others. I think this is, I guess, what we mean when we say we've truly understood something. And how do we get there? I'm not sure. It is somehow related to causation, because I think when we think about causation, which is necessary for prediction, the way we usually think about causes is very similar to the thing with the stars. We don't understand causes. We don't really understand what we even mean by something being a cause. At least I've so far not really seen really good explanations for what we mean with precision when we say that something caused something else. There are some conceptions of causality, like push-pull causality, as Searle once put it, where we have the intuitive felt sense that if a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, then the first ball will be the cause for the second to move. And we say, well, this is the cause. The cause is the movement of the first ball hitting the second ball. But that's not a precise definition of causation. It's an intuition, or it's basically capturing how experience usually presents itself to us, which is when we see a billiard ball hitting a different billiard ball, all other things being equal, the second one moves to the side. In other words, they can't occupy the same position in space and time. Why this is the case, I don't think we really know. So basically, the name causation in this context is not really explanatory, it is more descriptive. It just says, look, in this situation, we have so far always experienced phenomenon A being followed by phenomenon B. So we've only experienced it as this being the sequence of events once we're in a specific context of observation. But a more precise definition of what actually counts as a cause, I couldn't really come up with. I couldn't really define and clarify, except for maybe fleshing out different metaphors which we use to describe different contexts of causation. I think this is something we can do, and this is something that Aristotle did. I think this might be a project which has been developed even further. So, for example, the way thoughts can be causes or ideas can be causes is different from the way a billiard ball's movement is the call for a second ball's movement. For example, you have a person walking on every day, walking the same distance in front of your house, and at a certain day the person's behavior might be different towards you. They might be greeting you every single day, but on one specific day they are not greeting you. The behavior is significantly other. And the thing that is different from all the other days so far is that at that specific day the person might think that you have offended their wife or something like that. So, in other words, the only difference is that the person holds a specific belief. And that belief being there, in this context we would say, is the reason why the person is not greeting me. It's the cause for the person not greeting me. And this kind of cause is evidently not the kind of billiard ball cause, right? Where one thing is pushing a different thing, although there is maybe some metaphorical resemblance here. Metaphorically here, holding a certain belief is pushing the person kind of to do something that they otherwise would not or would do. And this is, again, bringing us back to the whole thing with the stars, looking at the stars, not knowing anything about the stars, and yet being able to predict their behavior. In this situation as well, we don't need to understand how beliefs relate to behavior to be able to say that the belief is the cause for someone's behavior or lack of behavior. It is perfectly reasonable in this context to say the person holding a specific belief is the reason why they are not greeting me. This has itself explanatory power, and as much explanatory power as you can have in this given situation. You don't need the explanatory power in this given situation to be able to predict and to causally, if you want, to reduce the situation down to its molecules. So starting with the smallest thing that you can observe, going to the next larger unit, going then somehow ending up with action, with human action. I don't think it works this way anyway. But this is not something that is required for the explanation to be a complete explanation. Because all you need in the situation, all you need to know in the situation to be able to explain it, is to know that the neighbor thinks that I have offended their spouse, for example. And this is all that I need, on the other hand, to be able to make a difference in the situation, in the given situation. To be able to act in a way as to, for example, excuse myself or clarify something so that I can have an impact on future actions. And look how, on the one hand, simple this whole thing is. So everyday causality, in a sense, is basically nothing else but looking at reality, expecting something, and when it doesn't come true, looking for what is different or what is missing so that my expectation is not coming true. Right? You're expecting the person to greet you, they're not greeting you. What's missing? What's different? And that difference we usually call cause. And we have no understanding for how the process of causes actually operates. How do you get from beliefs to action? No idea, no clue. How do you get from a mental representation, from something that's in your mind, to not only bodily movement, or greeting or not greeting someone, but even to social phenomena? Right? Greeting is not something that's personal. Greeting someone is something that's a social construct. How do you get from a belief that you hold about something to a social construct that is something entirely different? I have no idea. I have no clue. And yet we're able to meaningfully speak about these situations, and even in an exhaustive manner, because once you've understood that the person just simply believes something that might be true or false and something you can clarify, you have fully explained the situation. There is nothing else to be explained there. And if you were to go to the brain level, to the cell level, you wouldn't clarify things more. You would actually confuse things more. You would actually make things less comprehensible, because you wouldn't be even able to define what a belief is. That's where usually academics end up. When they look at those phenomena and actually try to help by looking at the details with a magnifying glass, what they end up doing is they can't capture even the most simple given situations. Like, for example, someone is greeting you. In scientific terms, you can't define someone. As funny as this might sound, you can't define someone. You can't really define greeting. You can't really define intentions, beliefs. All of those things are so difficult to capture in a precise scientific language. It's not a surprise that actually postmodernism has been winning out in the 20th century, because it basically declared all of those concepts undefinable, right? The moment somebody tried to define one of those concepts that are existing in our everyday world, and even the most simple concepts, again, like greeting someone, postmodernism came and said, well, look, this is just one interpretation. You can interpret it in 10 different more ways. So you can't basically come up with any relevant concept about what it's like to be human and define it and be happy about everybody agreeing on the concept. Everybody basically started disagreeing on these concepts, and really simple stuff. I mean, simple in the stuff of given stuff, like, for example, personal identity, the ego, the felt sense of you being an observer and the world being out there. All of those people didn't agree about. So this is the very weird situation we find ourselves in today, that science is not really helping us by trying to give us more precise definitions and more precise explanations, while on the other hand, the explanations that would be exhaustive and would be actually relatively simple, they don't go beyond what they do in the given situation. So in a given situation, I would be able to understand why the person is not greeting me and fully exhaustively understand the situation. And yet I would not get beyond that. I would not better understand what beliefs are. I would not better be able to understand what the spectrum of possible reactions would be, because just because you hold a belief, it doesn't mean that you always have to do one thing. You can do a dozen different things coming from one belief. This is something that's not clarified by our explanation right now. We have explained why the person is not greeting us, but given a different social construct that the person might be holding, they might think that you have offended their spouse, but still greet you, because they have a different conception of what you do in such a given situation. All of those things we have not covered with our exhaustive explanation. So we're basically not really smarter, but at least capable to act in this given social context. And I'm not sure that science as a whole has really a better understanding of what causation is, and a much better understanding of what we're actually doing when we're trying to figure out the world. It seems basically we're doing what, again, we've been doing hundreds and thousands of years ago, by looking at the stars, starting from a given starting point. And once you have that starting point, once you have experience, once you have something given to you, you can cohere experience and you can predict how experience will unfold. But we don't have a deeper understanding of any of it behind it, right? We don't really have a deeper understanding of what those stars actually are, metaphorically speaking. And the things that today are the stars, still the stars, and still mysterious if you want, is to make those links between, for example, the micro, the smallest observable, and the social sphere. It's not something that goes from levels of size, so that you can get from molecules to metaphors to social reality. I don't think this is how it works. And I'm not sure anybody really knows how it works. Once you are in a specific plane or level of description. Then you can do predictions, and then you can do explanations. Just that I showed you, the explanation with the neighbor not greeting me is a valid explanation, even though it's an explanation taken from the life world. It's not a scientific, it's a pre-scientific, if you want, explanation. Yet it's perfectly valid within its domain. And this is what we do. As soon as we cut up something into a domain, we can do valid descriptions, we can do causal descriptions, I mean. We can do predictions, but we can't really bind the whole thing together. We can't bring the whole thing together into one unified universe. It's just bits and pieces. And it's funny how everybody's starting from their own domain. Some people are starting from historicity, as if you want, the given world from which you begin to create patterns. Others begin with social action. There's political action, there are political actors. Those people specialize in, for example, political action, and you don't have to have any understanding of anything surrounding you to be really good as a political actor. You might be a really convincing political actor. You might be able to predict people's tendencies, who will vote for you, and what specific statements people will like and what statements people will dislike. You will be able to do that without having any further and deeper understanding of why people are behaving in this specific manner. You will be basically looking at people like they were stars. You will have no understanding for what they are, and yet be able to predict their behavior to a certain degree. And all this is really confusing because as a child I always felt that causality is something that's very clear, and it's something that must be clearly defined in physics, and physicists know what it is, and they have very precise terms for what causality is. But I'm not so sure anymore. I think we are running mostly on intuitions here, and on relatively vague metaphors. And depending on the context, we mean by causality, we mean very, very different things, which is made possible again by the fact that all that we mean in this term in many cases is simply if something is missing, something else would not be the case. But since we don't have any understanding of what this thing missing is at its heart, we can use the concept of causality in basically any kind of realm. It's not limited to the physical realm, even though it might stem from the physical realm and physical observation. It might be using it metaphorically and moving it into other domains. This might be the case. But still, lacking a deeper understanding of what the component parts are, we're still able to meaningfully speak about what causes are in a given situation, even though we don't know anything about, if you want, the essence of those causes. And all this is really, really confusing. It's really not at all what I expected causality to be. I expected causality to be a very, very clear push-pull relationship where you have clear defined boundaries of what can cause something else, and very precise relationships. It appears it's the exact opposite. It appears that causality works with the most fuzzy things that we have the least understanding of. You can still have a causal relationship concept in these cases. That's really weird.